At my father's funeral, my sister-in-law leaned close enough that only I could hear her. Her voice was soft, confident. "Oh, your husband gets the company," she whispered. "And the 600 million. She smiled like she had already won. The chapel was silent. Executives sat frozen in polished suits. My mother sobbed quietly beside me. My father's coffin rested at the front, draped in white lilies. Everyone expected me to break, to cry, to protest. Instead I nodded, and quietly thanked her. Because what she didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that my father had planned for this moment long before he died. Before we start, make sure to hit like and subscribe. And really, I'm curious. Where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The funeral was nothing like the quiet, modest services people imagine when they think of grief. This was my father's farewell, carefully orchestrated, meticulously attended. The front rows were filled with board members, senior executives, longtime investors, and people who had flown in from 3 different countries just to be seen paying their respects. Dark suits, polished shoes, carefully controlled expressions, power dressed as mourning. I sat beside my mother, her hands trembling in mine, her eyes swollen from days of crying. She hadn't slept. Neither had I. Across the aisle, my brother sat stiffly, his jaw clenched, staring straight ahead like he was already bracing for a storm. And beside him, perfectly composed, sat my sister-in-law. She wore black, of course, but it was designer black. Tailored. Intentional. Her posture was relaxed, almost casual, as if this were a board meeting rather than a funeral. She scanned the room the way people do when they're counting allies. Measuring influence. Calculating reactions. When the priest paused between readings, that was when she leaned toward me. Just slightly. Close enough that her perfume cut through the heavy scent of lilies. That was when she delivered her whisper. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough to make sure it landed. I felt a few nearby heads turn, not because they heard her words but because they saw my stillness. In a room filled with people trained to read power shifts, silence is never ignored. The weight of the moment pressed down on my chest. My father's coffin sat just ahead of us, polished wood reflecting soft light from the stained glass windows. His name engraved in gold. A man who had built an empire from nothing, now reduced to a single unmoving form. And in that space, between grief and legacy, my sister-in-law chose to stake her claim. She didn't look at my mother. She didn't look at the coffin. She looked at me. Waiting. Waiting for the reaction she expected. The public unraveling. The proof that she had finally stepped into a position above me. But I had learned something from my father long ago. People who are winning don't need to announce it. So I stayed still. I kept my breathing steady. I didn't turn my head. I didn't let my face betray what I felt. Around us, the service continued, but something had already shifted. Because humiliation only works if you accept it. And in that moment, while my sister-in-law believed she had just ended me, I realized she had just revealed herself. To understand why my sister-in-law felt so confident that day, you need to understand my family. And more importantly, how power moved within it. My father was a self-made man. The kind people love to quote but rarely understand. He didn't inherit money. He didn't marry into it. He built his company from a rented office, a second-hand desk, and an obsession with control. Every contract, every hire, every decision passed through him. To the world he was brilliant. To us he was careful. My brother Ethan was his opposite. Charismatic. Loud. Always certain he was destined for something big. Growing up, people gravitated toward him naturally. Teachers. Friends. Investors later on. He had a way of making people believe in him, even when he hadn't done much to earn it yet. My father admired that confidence. Or at least he pretended to. I was the quiet one. The observant one. The daughter who listened more than she spoke. While Ethan was being groomed publicly, invited to meetings, introduced to executives, praised at dinners, I worked quietly behind the scenes. I learned how the company functioned. How decisions were really made. How money moved. How people lied when they thought no one important was watching. My sister-in-law, Claire, entered our lives 10 years ago, and from the beginning she understood appearances. She understood titles. She understood what it meant to be seen standing beside the heir. She didn't hide her ambition. She polished it. At family gatherings she talked about expansion, about branding, about what we should do with the company someday. She spoke as if the future was already hers to manage. Most people found her impressive, confident, forward-thinking. My father listened, and said very little. People mistook his silence for approval. They always do. What no one seemed to notice, except me, was who my father trusted when things went wrong. When a deal collapsed. When an executive needed replacing. When something delicate required discretion, not spectacle. That's when he called me. Not Ethan. Not Claire. Me. I never challenged my brother publicly. I never competed for attention. I didn't need to. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it watches. And sometimes, it lets people believe exactly what they want. Until the moment belief becomes a liability. By the time my father died, everyone thought they understood how the inheritance would unfold. Everyone except the one person who mattered most. The company wasn't just valuable because of the money. $600 million was the headline number people whispered about, but that wasn't what made it powerful. It was influence. My father's firm touched everything. Real estate, logistics, manufacturing, technology. Quietly. Strategically. He didn't chase publicity. He bought leverage. Entire supply chains depended on decisions made inside glass conference rooms with his name on the door. Governments consulted him. Competitors feared him. Employees respected him because he remembered names, families, and mistakes. To outsiders it looked like success. To insiders it felt like gravity. My sister-in-law understood the surface value immediately. Titles excited her. The idea of walking into a room and being introduced as the owner thrilled her more than the work itself ever could. She loved the attention that came with proximity to power, especially when it wasn't earned directly. She started behaving as if the company already belonged to her. At corporate events she spoke to executives like subordinates. She hinted at future restructures, joked about cleaning house, and made casual remarks about who would and wouldn't survive once leadership changed. People laughed nervously. Some flattered her. Others took notes. I watched all of it quietly. Because what Claire never understood was this. My father never trusted people who treated power like a costume. He believed authority was something you carried, not something you displayed. And the more someone talked about control, the less he believed they deserved it. While she was busy collecting admiration, I was doing something far less visible. I was learning. I reviewed internal reports. I handled sensitive disputes. I resolved problems before they ever reached the board. When something threatened the company's stability, my father didn't call meetings, he called me. No announcements. No praise. Just responsibility. To Claire I was irrelevant. The background character. The daughter without ambition. She mistook silence for weakness. And my father allowed her to. He had always believed that people reveal their true nature when they think the prize is already theirs. By the time illness slowed him down, Claire's confidence had grown unchecked. She spoke openly about what comes next. About how Ethan would finally step into his rightful role. About how the company needed a more aggressive vision. My father listened the way he always did. With patience. With restraint. And with a plan no one else could see. Because the company everyone wanted wasn't a reward. It was a responsibility. And not everyone who desired it was capable of surviving what came with it. The days after the funeral blurred together in a haze of condolence calls and formal meetings. But beneath the surface politeness, something had already begun to shift. People talk when they believe the outcome is settled. And Claire believed it was. I noticed it first at the office reception following the service. A small gathering. Coffee cups. Low voices. Claire stood near the window holding court. She laughed easily, her tone relaxed as if grief were already behind her. We'll be making some changes soon, she said casually, just loud enough to be heard. The company needs fresh energy. A few people smiled. Others glanced away. No one asked questions. Yet when she moved on, conversations stopped. Heads leaned together. Whispers replaced laughter. By the end of the week, similar comments reached me from 3 different departments. Claire had mentioned restructuring timelines that didn't exist. She spoke about board approvals that hadn't happened. She referenced authority she didn't yet have. People were confused. And confusion is dangerous in a company built on precision. One executive asked me quietly in the hallway, Has something been finalized already? I shook my head. Nothing has changed. He frowned. Not relieved. Concerned. What Claire didn't realize was that my father's employees had learned to read his habits over decades. Sudden power shifts didn't happen. Announcements were never made casually. Authority was documented, controlled, verified. Claire skipped all of that. She assumed inheritance worked like gossip. Say it enough times and it becomes real. At lunch one afternoon, I overheard her telling a group of senior managers that she would be streamlining leadership once everything was official. She smiled while she said it, like someone enjoying a private joke. The room went quiet. Later that same day, 2 department heads requested separate meetings with me. Not with my brother. Not with Claire. With me. They asked careful questions. Neutral questions. The kind people ask when they're trying not to panic. I answered truthfully. The will had not been read. Control had not been transferred. Nothing was guaranteed. Their shoulders relaxed. Their trust shifted. That was when I realized Claire had made her first mistake. Not greed. Greed is common. Her mistake was impatience. By trying to step into power before it was given, she exposed herself to the very people who understood power best. And without knowing it, she had begun turning the company against her, one uneasy conversation at a time. While everyone else believed my father measured people by confidence and ambition, I knew better. What he valued most was restraint. Some of my clearest memories of him weren't in boardrooms or public events, but in quiet spaces. Late evenings in his study, the soft hum of city traffic outside, stacks of documents spread across his desk. He never raised his voice. Never rushed his thoughts. He taught through observation, not instruction. You learn more when people think you're not important, he once told me without looking up from a contract he was reviewing. They stop performing. They start revealing. At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant. Years later, I lived it. When executives argued loudly, my father listened silently. When someone overpromised, he waited to see what they delivered when no one was watching. He distrusted people who celebrated before outcomes were finalized. Victory announced early is usually insecurity, he said. Those lessons stayed with me. During the last year of his life, when illness forced him to slow down, our private conversations became more frequent. He called me late at night to discuss concerns he didn't want shared openly. Subtle shifts in loyalty. Behavioral changes. People who suddenly spoke louder than they used to. Claire's name came up more than once. She's very eager, he said one evening, carefully choosing his words. Eagerness isn't ambition. It's hunger. I asked him if he trusted Ethan to lead the company. He paused for a long time before answering. I trust your brother's heart, he said finally. But leadership requires something else. And not everyone around him understands the weight of what they're reaching for. He never told me what his final plans were. He didn't need to. My father believed that true preparation didn't require explanation. It required readiness. Before he died, he gave me one last piece of advice. Never confront greed directly, he said. Greed collapses on its own. All you have to do is give it room. Sitting in that funeral chapel days later, listening to Claire whisper her assumptions, I finally understood everything he had been preparing me for. This wasn't about inheritance. It wasn't about money. It was about revealing character. And my father had known exactly who would expose themselves the moment they believed the prize was already theirs. The will was scheduled to be read 1 week after the funeral. Not privately. Not quietly. My father had insisted on a formal setting. We gathered in the main conference room at headquarters, the same room where billion-dollar decisions had been made for decades. Floor-to-ceiling windows. A long polished table. Leather chairs that seemed to hold the weight of history. At one end sat the attorneys. At the other, my family. Around us, select board members and senior executives waited in carefully controlled silence. Claire arrived early. She wore confidence like armor. Her posture was relaxed, her smile effortless. She greeted people as if she already belonged at the head of the table, offering nods that felt more like acknowledgments than greetings. When she sat beside my brother, she placed her hand over his, possessive, reassuring. He didn't pull away. I sat across from them, quietly reviewing nothing at all. My hands rested calmly on the table. I didn't bring notes. I didn't need them. Everything that mattered was already in motion. The lead attorney cleared his throat. "We are here to formally read the last will and testament," he said, his voice neutral, practiced. The room grew still. Claire leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs slowly, deliberately. She glanced at me once, just long enough to make sure I noticed how comfortable she looked. How certain. The attorney began with the formalities. Personal belongings. Charitable donations. Provisions for my mother. Each line read aloud was met with polite nods, restrained reactions. Claire waited patiently, confident that the real prize was coming. Then the tone changed. The attorney paused, adjusted his glasses, and looked directly at the board members. "Regarding the controlling interest of the company," he said carefully, "there are conditions." Claire's smile didn't falter, but it tightened. Conditions weren't unexpected. My father loved structure. Still, I felt the room lean forward collectively, drawn by something unscripted. "The company will not be transferred immediately," the attorney continued. "Effective immediately, all voting authority remains with the board under temporary oversight." A ripple moved through the room. Quiet murmurs. Exchanged glances. Claire shifted in her chair. The attorney raised a hand, silencing the room before continuing. "This arrangement will remain in place until specific criteria outlined in the will are satisfied." Claire finally leaned forward. "Excuse me," she said smoothly. "How long is temporary?" The attorney didn't answer her directly. He turned another page. "That," he said, "depends entirely on compliance." For the first time I saw uncertainty flicker across her face. Just briefly. But enough. And as the attorney continued reading, I realized something profound was happening. This wasn't the inheritance Claire had imagined. This wasn't even a transfer of power. It was a test. And everyone in that room, especially the ones who thought they were winning, had just been entered into it. The attorney didn't rush. That alone made the room uneasy. He let the silence stretch just long enough for assumptions to begin collapsing. Claire glanced at my brother, then back at the papers, her confidence still intact, but now forced. She expected a delay, not resistance. Pause, not a barrier. "During the oversight period," the attorney continued, "all major financial decisions will require unanimous board approval." A subtle shift rippled through the room. Board members straightened. Pens moved. One executive quietly closed his folder, suddenly alert. This wasn't ceremonial language. This was control being redistributed. Claire smiled politely. "That's reasonable," she said, her voice smooth. "Until things are finalized." The attorney didn't acknowledge her comment. "Additionally," he said, turning another page, "all executive authority is suspended pending a full operational review." That was the moment her composure slipped. "Suspended," she repeated a fraction too quickly. "You mean temporarily reassigned?" The attorney looked up for the first time since he'd begun reading. "No," he said calmly. "Suspended." The word landed hard. My brother shifted in his seat, confusion etched across his face. He leaned toward Claire, whispering something urgent. She didn't respond. Her eyes stayed locked on the document, scanning as if sheer focus could rewrite the words. Around us, reactions varied. Some executives looked relieved. Others looked alarmed. Everyone understood what this meant. Power wasn't moving forward. It was being locked down. "The review," the attorney continued, "will assess compliance with internal conduct standards, fiduciary responsibility, and ethical leadership expectations." Ethics. That word didn't belong in inheritance discussions unless someone had anticipated a problem. Claire cleared her throat. "And how long is this review expected to take?" she asked carefully. "There is no set timeline," the attorney replied. "Completion depends on findings." The room fell silent again. Not polite silence this time. Real silence. The kind that follows realization. Claire's fingers tightened around her pen. She laughed lightly, trying to reclaim the atmosphere. "I'm sure this is all procedural," she said. "My husband and I are happy to cooperate." I watched several board members exchange glances. Not reassuring ones. Because they knew something Claire didn't. My father had never implemented vague safeguards. If he delayed power, it was because he expected resistance. If he demanded reviews, it was because he anticipated exposure. As the attorney continued outlining the scope of the oversight, I felt the weight in the room shift. Away from expectation and towards scrutiny. This wasn't a delay. It was containment. And for the first time since the funeral, Claire looked around the room and realized something essential had changed. She wasn't being welcomed into power. She was being examined. The attorney paused again. Longer this time. By now, no one mistook the silence for ceremony. It was deliberate. Every pause allowed tension to build, every breath giving people just enough time to imagine outcomes before having them stripped away. There is an additional provision, he said at last. One my client instructed us to read in full. Claire straightened. She smoothed her jacket, regaining composure the way practiced performers do when the spotlight turns harsh. My brother exhaled slowly as if preparing himself for something he still didn't understand. The attorney adjusted his glasses and began. Any individual seeking controlling authority, executive leadership or financial benefit beyond standard inheritance must meet the ethical continuity requirement outlined in Appendix C. A few board members leaned forward. They had copies of the document, but very few had reached the appendix yet. The ethical continuity requirement, the attorney continued, mandates a comprehensive review of conduct, professional behavior, internal communications and treatment of subordinates over the previous 5 years. 5 years. Claire's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. This review, he added, will be conducted independently and will include anonymous testimony from employees, documented correspondence and internal audit findings. Anonymous testimony. The room shifted. Someone cleared their throat. A pen clattered softly against the table. My brother turned to Claire again, this time openly alarmed. "What is this?" he whispered. She shook her head. "It's nothing," she murmured back, though her voice lacked conviction. The attorney continued, unbothered. Failure to meet the ethical continuity requirement will result in permanent disqualification from leadership roles, forfeiture of discretionary trust benefits, and reassignment of authority to the designated successor. That was the moment the air changed. Not confusion. Not curiosity. Fear. Claire raised her hand. "Excuse me," she said, forcing a smile that no longer reached her eyes. "I'm not an employee. Surely this applies only to executives." The attorney met her gaze evenly. "It applies to anyone exercising influence within the company," he replied. "Formally or informally." Her smile faltered. Because influence was exactly what she had been using. The attorney turned one final page. "My client anticipated that certain individuals might assume authority prematurely," he read. "This clause exists to protect the company from entitlement, coercion and reputational harm." I felt my pulse steady. This wasn't improvisation. This wasn't reactionary. My father had written this knowing exactly who would reveal themselves first. Around the table, realization spread quietly. This wasn't about paperwork or process. It was about behavior. About patterns. About the things people do when they believe no one is watching. Or worse, when they believe they're untouchable. Claire looked around the room, searching for reassurance. She found none. No nods. No smiles. No allies. Because the clause no one expected didn't accuse anyone directly. It didn't need to. It simply invited the truth to speak for itself. The review began quietly. That was the most unsettling part. There were no announcements. No accusations. No dramatic confrontations. Just a series of carefully worded emails from an independent firm my father had retained long before his death. Requests for records. Requests for access. Requests for time. Claire tried to appear cooperative. She always did well when she believed performance mattered more than substance. She smiled through meetings, offered polished explanations, and reassured my brother that this was all procedural. Temporary. Inconvenient but harmless. He was wrong. The first shift came from the middle managers. The ones who had stayed silent for years. People who had no ambition for titles, only stability. When anonymity was guaranteed, restraint disappeared. Stories emerged. Emails surfaced. Patterns formed. Claire had a habit of bypassing proper channels. Of issuing suggestions that felt more like directives. Of implying authority she didn't officially hold. Employees described meetings where disagreement was quietly punished. Where loyalty was rewarded but only when it was personal, not professional. One message stood out in particular. A forwarded email chain where Claire referred to a senior analyst as replaceable, because he had questioned a decision she favored. Another where she hinted that certain promotions would make more sense once leadership transitioned. Leadership she did not yet have. As findings accumulated, the tone inside the company shifted. People stopped speculating and started connecting dots. Conversations that had once happened behind closed doors moved into hallways. The name Claire no longer carried excitement. It carried caution. My brother noticed it before she did. "Why won't anyone return my calls?" he asked me one evening, frustration edging into his voice. "It's like they're avoiding us." I didn't answer immediately. Because avoidance is often the first sign of accountability. The review team didn't stop at employee testimony. They examined communication patterns, expense approvals, informal influence over decisions that should have required oversight. Nothing illegal. Nothing explosive on its own. But together it painted a picture. Not of leadership. Of manipulation. Claire sensed the shift and tried to regain control the only way she knew how: pressure. She confronted department heads. Questioned loyalty. Demanded reassurance. Every move only confirmed what the review was already uncovering. Fear doesn't create authority. It exposes its absence. When the preliminary findings were shared with the board, the room was silent. Not shocked. Just disappointed. These were people who had dedicated decades to building something stable. They didn't fear conflict. They despised instability. Claire had become a liability. Still, no one confronted her directly. My father had designed the process that way. He believed people deserved the dignity of watching their own behavior catch up to them. By the time Claire realized the review wasn't ending quickly, it was already too late. Trust had shifted. Support had evaporated. And the narrative she thought she controlled was no longer hers to manage. Greed hadn't betrayed her. Her own history had. And it was only beginning to speak. The confrontation didn't happen the way Claire imagined it would. There was no dramatic accusation. No raised voices. No sudden expulsion from the building. It happened during a regularly scheduled board meeting. The kind that appears routine on calendars. The kind people attend expecting updates and projections, not consequences. Claire arrived late, heels clicking sharply against the marble floor, confidence carefully reapplied. She took her seat beside my brother and placed a stack of notes on the table as if prepared to lead. She wasn't. The chair of the board cleared his throat and nodded toward the independent review team seated near the window. Their presence alone shifted the atmosphere. Conversations stopped. Phones were silenced. Attention narrowed. The lead reviewer spoke calmly. Methodically. Each word deliberate. He outlined patterns of influence. Described instances where informal authority had been used to override proper channels. Cited testimony from multiple departments, anonymized but consistent. He never used the word abuse. He didn't need to. The room absorbed the information in silence. Claire smiled at first. A practiced expression of disbelief. She leaned toward my brother, whispering something sharp, then turned back toward the table. "This feels exaggerated," she said lightly. "I've always been passionate. Sometimes that gets misinterpreted." No one responded. The reviewer continued. He referenced internal emails, timing discrepancies, expense approvals that bypassed procedure. Nothing scandalous on its own. But together it revealed a pattern of entitlement. Authority assumed, not granted. Claire's smile faded. She interrupted again. "This is clearly personal," she said, her voice tightening. "I don't even hold an official title." "That is precisely the concern," the board chair replied evenly. The words landed harder than any accusation. My brother spoke then, his voice uncertain. "Are you saying she's disqualified?" The reviewer didn't answer. The attorney did. "Based on the ethical continuity clause," he said, "the board is required to vote." A vote. Claire stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "You can't strip someone of power they haven't even been given." "That's correct," the chair replied calmly. "Which is why this vote concerns future eligibility." The room went still. The vote was brief. Efficient. No discussion. No speeches. One by one hands were raised. Claire watched them fall away. When the decision was announced, she didn't shout. She didn't cry. She simply stood there, rigid, eyes scanning faces that no longer reflected admiration or fear, only finality. He turned to my brother, searching for support. He didn't meet her gaze. For the first time since the funeral, her confidence truly collapsed. Not publicly. Internally. You could see it in the way her shoulders tightened, the way her hands trembled as she gathered her things. This wasn't humiliation. It was exposure. And as she walked out of that room, everyone understood something my father had always known. Power doesn't disappear loudly. It leaves quietly, once everyone stops pretending it belongs where it never did. The board didn't adjourn immediately after the vote. There was still one item left on the agenda. The attorney cleared his throat again, a subtle signal that the most important part had been saved for last. Claire had already left the room, but the air still carried the tension she'd created. Sharp, unsettled, unfinished. This concludes the ethical review, the attorney said. However, there is a final directive from the late Mr. Hawthorne that must now be enacted. Every head turned. I felt my spine straighten, not in anticipation but recognition. My father always revealed truth only after illusion had collapsed. He believed clarity was wasted on people who hadn't yet earned it. The attorney opened a sealed folder. In the event that the ethical continuity clause is triggered, he read, authority shall transfer not to assumption, but to demonstrated stewardship. Stewardship. The word echoed in the room. For that reason, he continued, the designated successor for interim and long-term oversight is the executor of the trust. Pause. Then my name. It wasn't dramatic. No gasps. No murmurs. Just a quiet shift like gravity recalibrating itself. I had been named executor years ago, privately, deliberately, without ceremony. My father never explained it to anyone else. He didn't need to. He trusted preparation over validation. The attorney slid a letter across the table toward me. Handwritten. Familiar. I encourage the board to read this aloud, he said. The chair nodded and unfolded the paper. My children, the letter began, if you are hearing this, then ambition has revealed itself and patience has endured. The room stilled. I built this company to outlast ego. Not to reward desire but to protect responsibility. Those who reach for power before understanding its cost should never be entrusted with it. I kept my eyes on the table listening. To the one who waited, who listened, who learned, who never demanded, I leave what matters most. Not ownership but guardianship. Not applause but authority. Several board members glanced toward me then. Not with surprise. With understanding. My father had never intended to hand his legacy to the loudest voice in the room. He designed a system that allowed people to disqualify themselves. Patiently, publicly, undeniably. The attorney finished reading and folded the letter. The board chair turned to me. Are you prepared to accept the role? He asked. I nodded once. I am. No speech. No celebration. Because real power doesn't arrive with noise. As the meeting adjourned, people approached quietly. Executives who had once overlooked me now met my eyes with respect. Not fear. Not flattery. Trust. My father's final move wasn't revenge. It wasn't punishment. It was protection. He didn't destroy anyone. He simply ensured that those who misunderstood power would never hold it. And in doing so he left behind something far more valuable than $600 million. He left behind the truth. The reaction didn't come all at once. It never does. First it was subtle. A change in tone. Conversations that stopped when I entered now resumed naturally. Emails that once felt formal became honest. People who had avoided eye contact suddenly held it. The company was exhaling. Within hours of the announcement my inbox began to fill. Not with congratulations but with relief. Short messages. Careful words. Sentences people had been holding back for years. Thank you for protecting the team. I didn't know how to speak up before. I'm glad someone finally saw what was happening. These weren't junior employees chasing favor. They were department heads. Senior analysts. People who had built their careers here and feared watching it unravel under the wrong kind of leadership. One manager stopped me in the hallway later that afternoon. His voice was quiet. I should have said something earlier, he admitted. We all saw the signs. We just didn't know who would listen. I nodded. Because silence is rarely indifference. More often it's fear. What struck me most wasn't the criticism of Claire. It was the regret. People felt complicit, not because they supported her but because they didn't feel safe challenging her. That distinction mattered. By the next morning, the shift was undeniable. Teams moved faster. Meetings were calmer. Decisions were made with clarity instead of tension. It was as if an invisible weight had been lifted from the building. No one said her name, but everyone felt her absence. My brother avoided the office for days. When he finally returned, his posture had changed. The confidence he once borrowed from proximity to power was gone. In its place was something unfamiliar, uncertainty. He didn't blame me. He couldn't. The process had been transparent. The outcome unavoidable. One afternoon, a group of employees gathered near the break room window, quietly talking. When they noticed me, they stopped, not out of fear but respect. One of them spoke up. "We just want to say, we see the difference already." That was the moment I understood what my father had truly protected. Not money. Not control. People. The ones who stayed late to fix mistakes. The ones who believed in building something stable, not flashy. The ones who deserved leadership that didn't rely on intimidation to function. Trust doesn't return instantly, but it begins the moment people believe the rules apply to everyone. As I walked back to my office, I realized something else. Claire hadn't just lost her claim to the inheritance. She had lost the room. And once a room stops believing in you, no amount of ambition can win it back. My father had been right all along. Greed doesn't destroy companies. Unchecked power does. And for the first time since his death, I felt certain the company he built was finally safe. The consequences didn't arrive dramatically. They arrived quietly, one door closing at a time. Claire didn't return to the office after the board meeting. At first, people assumed she was regrouping, preparing a statement, planning her next move. That's what she had always done before. But days passed. Then weeks. Her name disappeared from calendars. Her access was revoked without ceremony. Her influence evaporated. Power once gone leaves very little behind. My brother tried to hold things together publicly. He attended meetings. Smiled when necessary. Spoke in measured tones. But the confidence he once carried so easily was fractured. Without Claire driving his certainty, he struggled to find footing. Decisions took longer. Questions replaced declarations. At home things were worse. They argued quietly at first, then openly. The inheritance she had treated as inevitable was no longer hers to manage, or even touch. The lifestyle she had envisioned began slipping through her fingers. Invitations stopped coming. Calls went unanswered. People who had once praised her ambitions suddenly remembered other commitments. She blamed everyone. The board. The process. Me. But deep down she knew the truth. Nothing had been taken from her. Nothing had been stolen. She had simply reached too soon. Within 2 months, the separation became official. Claire moved out of the house she had already mentally claimed as hers forever. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, least of all her. My brother didn't fight it. He didn't defend her the way he once might have. Some losses don't feel worth protecting. At the company, stability returned faster than expected. Projects resumed. Long-delayed initiatives moved forward. The fear that had lingered beneath the surface dissolved into something sturdier. Accountability. I didn't announce changes loudly. I didn't need to. I replaced pressure with clarity. Fear with structure. I listened more than I spoke. Exactly the way my father had taught me. People noticed. Not because I demanded respect, but because I created space for it to exist. One evening, as I locked my office and stepped into the quiet parking garage, I felt the weight of everything that had happened finally settle. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Resolution. Claire's greed hadn't just cost her the inheritance. It had cost her credibility. Her relationships. Her future within the world she believed she was destined to rule. My father had once told me that consequences don't chase people. They wait. And when the moment is right, they simply arrive. This chapter was closing. Not with chaos. Not with revenge. But with balance restored. And for the first time I felt ready to build something not just preserved, but better. The final piece of my father's legacy wasn't the company. It was the standard he left behind. 6 months later, the company felt different. Not louder. Not flashier. Steadier. The board meetings were shorter. Decisions were clearer. People spoke honestly without scanning the room first to see who held the most influence. The fear that once shaped conversations had been replaced by something far more productive. Trust. I didn't try to become my father. That was never the goal. I honored his legacy by refusing to imitate it. Where he guarded information tightly, I shared it responsibly. Where he tested people silently, I created systems that rewarded transparency before ambition could corrupt it. The company grew, not just financially but culturally. As for Claire, I rarely heard her name anymore. When I did, it was spoken carefully, like a reminder rather than a regret. She had moved on to something smaller, louder, and far less permanent. That suited her. Some people are built for moments, not legacies. My brother and I found a new balance. Not close. Not distant. Honest. He carried the weight of what he hadn't seen sooner, and I carried the responsibility of what I now held. We didn't talk about the inheritance anymore. We didn't need to. It had never really been about money. On the anniversary of my father's death, I returned to his old study. The desk was still there. The shelves unchanged. I opened the drawer where he used to keep his handwritten notes. Inside was a single card, yellowed with age. Read. Character reveals itself when reward feels inevitable. I understood then what he had given me. Not $600 million. Not control. Perspective. He had trusted me not because I was perfect, but because I was patient. Because I listened when others spoke too loudly. Because I understood that leadership isn't about claiming space but about protecting it. Greed didn't destroy my sister-in-law. Exposure did. And exposure doesn't require confrontation. It only requires time, structure, and the courage to let people show you who they really are. If there's one lesson my father left behind, it's this. The quiet ones aren't weak. They're waiting. And when the moment arrives, they don't need to announce their power. They simply step into it and let the truth do the rest.